Today, I'm going to be talking about evolution, specifically speciation, natural selection, and genetic drift, including what causes them and what kind of effect they have on evolution and the creation of new species. But before I get into it, I want to define a term: mutation. A mutation is a random, uncontrolled change in a genetic sequence which can lead to altered traits. These can be negative or positive. Mutations are always occurring in species that we have, and it's what allows for variance. It's what allows for the process of evolution to take place. Okay, so let's jump into the beginning, which is speciation. So what is speciation? Speciation is the formation of a new and distinct species during the course of evolution. So there's two main types of speciation. The two I'm going to focus on are allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric speciation is when you have two species that are geographically separated, which allows for different mutations to occur and spread throughout the different species, even though they were once the same. And sympatric is non-geographical separation. So, in the example that I have here, we had two different types of beetles. We had the green and we had the pink. So, let's say that all of these beetles used to live together. There wasn't a river here. They could have all been green, and the mutations that occurred would have shown different phenotypes, but they would have been interbreeding with one another, which means usually they would show the same kinds of mutations across a long period of time. Now we're going to introduce the river here, which is going to separate half the beetles across to each side. So let's say on this side there's a mutation which causes the beetles to turn pink, but the mutation doesn't occur over here. And let's say they just, through the process of natural selection, which we'll get into later, this helps them survive, so they actually keep this mutation. Now we have two different species, two of the same species that are having different mutations, and this can occur so widely that we get different species. Next, we're going to talk about sympatric. And like I said before, sympatric speciation is just a non-geographical barrier. So there has to be something else that prevents these species from interbreeding, from forming a new distinctive species. And there's two different types of sympatric. There's the pre-zygote barriers and the post-zygote barriers. Note that there are many different versions of this, many different occurrences that could happen, but these are just the two that I'm going to focus on. So, pre-zygotic barriers. We have behavioral isolation, temporal isolation, and habitat isolation. Example of this is like if you had two different species of birds. They could interbreed, but they don't. They never actually get to the point of creating a zygote. And this could be behavioral, like birds often attract mates through the songs that they sing. But let's say one type of bird doesn't attract another type of bird. That would be an instance of behavioral isolation. They never actually meet, that they aren't attracted to one another. Temporal isolation is like two different species of plants, some that come out at night, some that come out during the day, that may be able to actually reproduce, but don't because of the times that they're active. And habitat isolation is like if one of them is land-based and one's water-based. Even if they're right next to each other, they're never going to actually meet. And post-zygotic barriers is whenever a species is actually able to create an offspring, but there's a problem, either that the offspring can't survive or that the offspring can't reproduce. And that's what brings us into the idea of what a species actually is. A species has two requirements. It has to be able to breed with other things within its own species, and the offspring have to be able to reproduce. So when you have a case called like a liger, where it is the offspring of a lion and a tiger, the offspring can't actually reproduce, so a liger is not a species. We call these hybrids. And another thing that I want to point out here is that the actual isolation of two different species is not a driver for evolution. The isolation is not what caused these two species to evolve differently, or to actually have mutations. There has to be another factor that's causing the mutation here. This just explains of how they mutated differently. Okay, so now that you have a general understanding of what speciation is, let's talk about natural selection. Natural selection was founded by Darwin, and he was studying the Galapagos birds and trying to see which ones survived under which circumstances better. So, the idea of natural selection is that species with more beneficial traits will survive more often to produce similar offspring. Now, forgive my drawing here. I'm not very good, but in this drawing we have bird A and bird B. And the two differences between the birds is that this one has a long snout, this one has a very shorter but wider. This one's better at getting to flowers, and this one's better at cracking open nuts. So let's say we're in an environment where the only food source for these kind of birds are these nuts right here. Well, the mutation could say that there's some birds like this and some birds like that. It doesn't really matter, it's random. But the only bird that's actually going to survive is going to be bird B, because bird B is the only one that can get to its natural food source. So bird A is not going to be able to survive to produce offspring, and bird B is going to become the new dominant species. And this is the process of natural selection. If we have a mutation that occurs that allows a species to better survive or produce more offspring than its counterpart, then that kind of mutation is going to start taking over in the population. The type of environment will decide which bird survives to pass on the gene. So if the only food source is within the flowers, then bird A is going to survive. Or if we're in a situation where both resources are plentiful, there's not very much pressure for either bird to actually choose one, so we may actually keep both. This is what I was going on to before. For natural selection to actually occur, there needs to be some sort of pressure for a species to change. That could be like a predator noticing a species for being more colorful, or a species not being able to find a female to mate with. There has to be some sort of driver here in order for one of these birds to pick one of these mutations. Otherwise, they're both going to retain it, because both species are going to be able to produce as much offspring as each other. Now that you understand that, let's talk about genetic drift. Genetic drift is another form of choosing which kinds of mutations are passed down to the offspring. However, unlike natural selection, which can be more calculated, genetic drift is actually random. It's a change in allele frequency due to chance, and the allele frequency is how the genes are represented, which could change the phenotypes. There are two main ways, although there are other ways that this could be represented. We have the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. And I'm just going to quickly explain the differences here. The bottleneck effect, let's say we have a forest, and let's say we have squirrels living in the forest. Now let's say there's a forest fire that takes out all three of these trees, but this one tree is still remaining. The squirrels that live here are not really representative of what the entire population used to look like. However, since the majority of it was removed from the population, this is now the only remaining species which is actually going to reproduce. This is what causes the bottleneck effect. These alleles are going to be much more dominant in changing the future populations, the future offspring, because even if these are more wild or more random, more recessive, it's going to pass on to the children since we don't actually have competition here anymore. The second effect that I'm going to talk about is the founder effect. So here we have an island, and we have the pink birds that naturally live here. But due to some environmental change, we now have the purple birds, which were no longer allowed in their home. They're actually coming over to this island. And their presence is going to end up changing the pink birds, whether they interbreed or whether it changes the predators or the amount of food that's available. It's going to cause some mutations, and this is what is known as genetic drift. Them coming in here is actually going to alter the original mutations that were in place.